Okay. I'll pass it over to Ivory and Rain.
Okay, great. Thanks for having us, everybody. We're super excited about this workshop. Only a little bit nervous. So we're here to talk about building solidarity with queer and trans prisoners, and we're part of the Prisoner Correspondence Project, as Benji said, and we'll go more into what PCP does later in the presentation. First, we want to start with a land acknowledgement, which is going to be a bit tricky because this workshop is happening online. If you want, you can look at the nations that are on your specific land on this website. For us, I'll just acknowledge the land that Prisoner Correspondence Project mainly operates on. We're mainly on unceded Kanien'kehá:ka territory. The Kanien'kehá:ka are the traditional custodians of these lands and waters, and this island, Dojaque, colonially known as Montreal, has historically been an important meeting space for members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. The acknowledgements are frequently criticized for being performative, especially when they're not accompanied by any sort of like material action on decolonization, which is something that I think that we are very in agreement with at Prisoner Correspondence Project. For instance, Correctional Services Canada uses land acknowledgements on their website, and as the more that we talk about it on this in this presentation, I think the more it's going to become kind of like weird and messed up that they acknowledge the land that each of the prisons are on their website without doing really anything else. Indigenous people only make up 4% of the general population of Canada, but they make up 33% of Canada's federal prison population and 49% of Canada's female federal prison population. They're usually Indigenous people are usually overrepresented in prison in Canada. They're 9 times more likely to be incarcerated than non-Indigenous people in Canada. And this has led many people to connect contemporary prisons with the ongoing legacy of residential schools and sort of place the carceral system in Canada on a continuum with the genocide of Indigenous peoples in so-called Canada. So I just really wanted to foreground any conversation we have about prisons in Canada with just like the knowledge that we have to be working like really closely and in solidarity and deeply with like decolonization and real. So yeah, now we can move on to talking about where's the closest prison to you. We've prepared a Menti. People know what this is. You can go to menti.com and enter these numbers 8540 or 9488. 8540-9488. Or I think you can scan this QR code and you can answer the question, where's the closest prison to you? If you don't know, it's very okay to say unknown. It just helps us get to know where people are sort of coming from, and also hopefully gets you thinking about your like local contacts. Oh yeah, while people are filling out the Menti, I think we're going to introduce ourselves. So my name's Ivory. I use they them pronouns. I've been a member of the Outside Collective at Prisoner Correspondence Project since 2019. This workshop is going to be a bit of a beginner workshop, but we are also going to cover a lot of ground. I encourage you to take notes if you need to, but as Benji mentioned, it's also going to be recorded and available to you later. Just a heads up that we are going to mention some heavy topics such as suicide and sexual assault, although we won't be going in depth on any of them. These are just like things that come up a lot in the prison context. So, you know, do whatever you need to take care of yourself. We're obviously not going to be offended if people just log off midway through the presentation, no worries. Feel free to ask questions throughout in the chat. And then at the end, of course, of the Q&A, we will keep an eye on the chat, but we might save some for the end, depending on what the question is. And just finally, the last thing I'll say is just a inside, outside. When I say that, inside means like incarcerated. So if I said the inside collective, I mean the collective that's incarcerated, that is currently in prison. And the outside collective, or just outside, means that they're not in prison. I completely forgot to give you a chance to introduce yourself, Rain.
That's all good. I'm Rain. I got involved. Oh, I use they, them pronouns, or Z here pronouns. I got involved with the Prisoner Correspondence Project as a sort of volunteer and then collective member, I believe, at the end of 2022. And I got involved first as a pen pal in 2020.
Okay, cool. So those people have had more time to fill it out. Is someone coming here from America, or is Rikers the closest prison if you from of a location in? No,
I assume they're in the US.
they have to be the US. There's no way there'd be a closer prison upstate New York. Okay. Okay. Oh my gosh. People are really all over the place. That's cool. That's super cool. Yeah. The closest prison to us in Montreal is called Bordeaux, Bordeaux Detention Center. It's for people who don't know, Montreal's an island. I think people are often surprised in Montreal to find out that the closest prison to the city is actually still on the island. Um, yeah. I don't know if I should give people more time to answer, if we should like say our little thing that we usually say about this question.
I think you can go ahead.
Yeah. So the reason why we usually ask this question is because, oh my God, Richard J. Donovan, Texas? Sorry, I got distracted. We have to write so many letters to Donovan. That's crazy. The reason why we ask this question is to get people thinking about their local context, and also to point out that oftentimes people don't know the answer to this question. Like we can see here that one of the top answers is unknown. It seems like more people actually know that they're, or an equal amount of people know that they're the closest to Maplehurst, which is really cool. But usually people don't know the answer to this question when we ask it in a beginner workshop, unless they are or have family implicated in the criminal justice system, because of the way that prisons are like marginalize people like kind of like physically, in addition to like taking them out of their communities, but to like actually like push them to like sort of the edges of our awareness and the edges of our geographies. And sort of just like take people out of sight. It's very common for people to not know where their closest prisons are. Do you have anything to add about that, Reed?
No, I think that makes sense.
Really cool. So it's very interesting. I guess should we go ahead and start with the prison basics?
Yes. So I will be doing this part. So we started, and this is just to sort of give a little bit of information on the Canadian prison system. It's like very, very basic, because we don't, uh, there's like so much that you could say about it, but a lot of people don't know very much about the Canadian prison system. So we wanted to give some very, very 101 context. So we're going to start with a question again on the Menti. So kind of simple. How many people are incarcerated in Canada? And I'll give people like a second to look at that and put in what they think is the number of people incarcerated in Canada. And then we'll see what the real answer is. So I'll just give it like a second for people.
I guess we'll say like the number of people like currently. Actually, yeah.
Or currently or like on a given sort of average day. So I'll wait like a few more seconds.
This is a lot
Okay.
of fun. We've never used Menti before. It's like,
Yeah, we have never used it in a workshop before, so thank you guys for I don't know, trying it out with us. Okay, so to actually give the real answer, there are 35,000 people on a given day incarcerated in Canada. And of those, there are around 14,000 who are in federal custody, and 24,000 in provincial custody. So provincial, that means that someone has a sentence of 2 years or less, or in the majority of cases, they are in pretrial detention. And federal means that someone has a sentence of 2 years plus a day or more. So one thing to note is that nearly half of all incarcerated, so all those 35,000 incarcerated people in Canada, are incarcerated pre-trial and have not been found guilty of a crime. And although on a given day there are 24,000 people incarcerated in provincial prison, this is sort of an undercount in a sense of how many people are affected by the correction system on a provincial level. in a year because those sentences are often short or they're pretrial. So the number of people who actually pass through the correction system in a year is much higher. For example, in 2022, 2023, there were 163,000 admissions to provincial prison, and 61,000 of those were in Ontario. So we also wanted to discuss a few issues in Canadian prison. This is like an extremely brief overview compared to how much could be said about this. And a lot of these issues aren't sort of discussed as much in Canada as we hear about the United States. So some of these issues include the underpayment of labor. Most prisoners work and have jobs and work quite often quite difficult jobs. And are not paid anywhere close to even minimum wage. In the federal system, for example, the most that someone can make in a day is $7. And the majority of people aren't even making that much in a day of work. Other issues include the overrepresentation of Black and Indigenous people in the prison system, the overuse and use at all of solitary confinement, lack of access to proper health care, and denial of parole meaning release for people who have met the conditions for parole. We also wanted to talk a little bit specifically, since this organization is based in Ontario, about some issues in Ontario. So in Ontario prisons, deaths in custody have been steadily increasing. Last year, 46 prisoners died in Ontario's jails. The majority of these deaths have been recorded as overdoses, which could easily have been prevented if prisoners had access to support, proper health care, and safer drug supply. In what is often referred to as Ontario's deadliest jail, Maplehurst, where a quarter of these deaths took place, which I'll also note that some of you said that that's the closest prison to you. So this is kind of, maybe you're already aware of some of the issues, but this is something that is really horrifying. So prisoners have reported, among many other things, black mold, recently an outbreak of disease which killed 2 prisoners. Recently in the news, reports about a violent strip search of over 200 prisoners, after which prisoners were left without clothing, bedding, toilet paper, or non-essential medication for over 2 days. So these conditions are really, really horrifying. There's a lot more that could be said about it. And if you ever have read about it or do read about it, it's quite awful. And the conditions really in Canadian prison are not great. So yeah, and I'll pass it over to Ivory to talk about some historical moments in prisoners' rights.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to talk about, because we were just talking about how, in contemporary prisons in Canada, there's some really horrific issues. There's also resistance from people inside, and I don't want to, erase that. I want to, we actually want to highlight that there is, organized, resistance, coming from prisoners, about their, horrendous, quality of life. So in case people haven't heard of it, there's a thing called Prisoners Justice Day. It started in Canada in 1975, and it's a Memorial Day that's recognized every August 10th. It remembers incarcerated people who died inside that previous year. So, we were just talking about deaths in prison. This is exactly what that day is meant to highlight and talk about how so many of those deaths are preventable and simply would not have happened if that person had not been in prison. So it started in 1975 because that was the 1-year anniversary of the death of an inmate named Eddie Nayland by suicide at Millhaven Institute, which I'm not sure if it's still now, in Ontario. On the inside, it's marked by fasting and a list of demands for improvements in prisoners' living conditions. And on the outside, people in solidarity will organize vigils and speeches. So this is a pretty a notable example of prisoner resistance in Canada has been going on continuously for 50 years. But I will say that also the original list of demands for improvements in prisoners' living conditions 50 years ago have still not been met. So since we're here to talk about building solidarity, I think we're in between communities, specifically queer and trans community in prison. I also wanted to highlight previous times that the gay community or queer activists have like lined up with Prisoner Justice Day. On August 10th, 1992, ACT UP Montreal staged a mock hanging in protest of the handling of HIV in prisons. For people who don't know, ACT UP was an activist group calling for more government action in the US and Canada and Europe on AIDS and criticizing governmental inaction as being homophobic and racist. They were mostly around in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s. So ACT UP Montreal staged a mock hanging, and at this hanging, they also distributed pamphlets that called the way that HIV was being handled in prison, the return of capital punishment because it was just being handled so poorly. They called for harm reduction supplies to be distributed inside, so condoms and syringes, as well as equal medical care for prisoners with AIDS. So sometimes people really think about these two issues as being really separate, you know, like prisoner justice and prisoner rights and queer liberation and gay rights. And obviously, as an organization, we do not believe that. And I just really want to point out that, like, historically, there have been moments where these two movements have like overlapped before. I'll also say on this point that to this day, there are much higher rates of HIV in prison than outside of prison in Canada. And that also having HIV is criminalized federally in Canada via a disclosure law, and it's one of the more repressive disclosure laws. Yeah, so let's talk about some history, but gay rights history this time. I wanted to underline that historically, gay rights movements have actually been big confrontations with the police. You know, like Stonewall, pretty big one, right? It's like the one that they do on RuPaul's Drag Race or whatever. It was a clash with police because of laws that were being enforced against like sodomy, cross-dressing, also like the mafia and all that stuff. But a lot of like clashes between the gay community and cops who were just arresting them, checking their IDs and being like, oh, you don't look like what it says on your ID. You have to go over there. I'm going to put you in like the Queen's tank or whatever. So that's the version that we hear a lot. We should also consider that, so the people in this photo on the left are, which is the only photo from the night of Stonewall, are street kids. They're the people who, street kids. The people who were sleeping in Christopher Park outside of Stonewall Inn, so like gay homeless youth. And the reason why they're like on the front lines of this confrontation is because they were experiencing frequent run-ins with police, not just for being queer, but like for being a person who slept outside. So like when we were specifically talking about how prisoners are often left out of queer activist spaces, there's a part of it that's like by design of the carceral system. And the carceral system does this to everybody who enters it. Like prisons remove people from their communities, as we've mentioned. But it's also coming from the queer liberation movement or gay rights movements in terms of just like assimilationist tendencies, like trying to become more like white middle class, heteronormative society, reality TV without like really acknowledging that the roots of our movement is in like conflict with the police. It's a really insidious shift in gay rights away from the people who kind of like started it. So just to drive that point home, everyone knows who these people are, right? It's Sylvia Rivera, and Marsha P. Johnson, which are some of the most prominent figures in gay rights history. So they were Marsha was at Stonewall. They were frequently arrested for being trans. Like I said, it was illegal to cross-dress and that was being enforced, but also arrested for doing sex work. We could go on about this for a really long time. I'm just going to give a very short thing about an organization that the two of them started called STAR, Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, which aim to house queer homeless youth. Among other things, it also released a manifesto, and this manifesto calls in it for the immediate end of all police harassment and arrest of transvestites and gay straight people, and the release of transvestites and gay straight people from all prisons and all other political prisoners. It's pretty remarkable to me. So yeah, queer people have always been aggressively policed and targeted, even when the charge wasn't related to queerness, which is what they are acknowledging in this manifesto, calling attention to. So anti-police stuff has really been embedded in our movement since the beginning. And we know from this that these are voices that are not being added to the queer liberation movement, but voices that have been pushed out even though they were foundational to the movement. Like, let's say that even if there was no laws that could be construed as like homophobic or transphobic on the books that were being enforced, there were no laws. Police did not have any like homophobic or transphobic bias, prosecutors, judges, blah, blah, blah. If we lived in a world where no one in the criminal justice system was homophobic and no aspect of it was homophobic, queer people would still be more arrested than their cishet counterparts on average. Because then on average, queer people are more poor, more homeless, doing more sex work, and using more substances than cishet people. So this is why at Prisoner Correspondence Project, we're abolitionists. Again, like Rain said, we could talk about this for a lot longer. This is like quite a fast like introduction. We usually have like an hour-long workshop that we give on Abolition 101. But I'll just try to summarize some of the salient points. Prisoner Correspondence Project, we believe the best way to address the systemic harm for queer and trans people in prison is to get rid of prisons altogether. So literally prison abolition means getting rid of the carceral system. So prisons, jails, criminal psych wards, without replacing it with another system of state control. Because we believe prisons cause harm instead of preventing it. We also believe that there will always be harm in society, or as abolitionists, we acknowledge that there will always be harm in society. So once prisons are gone, how is that harm going to be addressed or prevented? There's a pretty famous abolitionist and geographer, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who has like a famous line about this. She says, abolition requires that we change one thing, everything. That's what's needed to be able to get rid of prisons. It's just like a complete restructuring of society. That's a really big thing to push for. But we know that things can change because prisons are not just like a part of life that have always existed. They're actually just like a thing that were invented in the 19th century. They were invented as an alternative to corporal punishment. Because before then, basically people would be like held in like detention cells waiting for like, you know, lashes or execution or whatever. The tragic part of this is that it was like humanitarians and social workers at the time pushing to bring punishment for criminal offenses in line with sort of like more gentle Christian values, like sort of improvement of the soul through labor and silence. That's why a lot of prisons are called like penitentiaries. It's like literally like thinking. But this has obviously caused actually like a lot of human suffering in its wake, to the degree that like one of the Christian groups that was the most involved in pushing for the invention of prisons are now abolitionists. That's the American. This is the kind of thing that's led Michel Foucault to say that prison reform is virtually contemporary with the prison itself. It constitutes as for its program. So basically, we know that prisons are just a thing that was invented. So we know that we can invent something else. And we also know that they were invented as a reform in and of themselves. So we know now that instead of focusing on reactions to harm, we need to ask ourselves more questions about where harm comes from, and we really need to criticize the entire carceral system and criminal justice system instead. A lot of big things. That is a very big topic. There are some resources like at the end of this presentation that will go more into them. Just want to say quickly that these are some like pillars of abolition that you can kind of use as like shorthand in case you're ever wondering whether something is abolitionist or not. This comes from a handbook called Instead of Prisons, published in 1972. It presents 3 pillars of abolition, which is the ones on the left. It's number 1, moratorium, just stop building prisons and jails. Building prisons and jails to relieve overpopulation in the past has always led to further overpopulation. Also decarceration, so freeing people who are currently in prison and reducing the current prison population, reducing the number of people under state control. As well as the 3rd pillar, excarceration, moving away from the carceral framework by setting up programs to divert people away from prison. So you can think of that as sort of like transformative justice efforts, asking why harm happens, and strengthening capacities to prevent or address harm and create processes for community accountability. Then there's some more questions on the side. Does it reduce the reach of jails, prisons, and surveillance in our everyday lives? Does it create resources and infrastructure that are accessible without police and prison guard contact? or does it build prisoner power? And I think if you start like applying to this, like to like news stories that you say about like, you know, like, oh, the police are doing this new thing, the police are doing this new thing, you'll start to see that a lot of these like reforms of the prison that the police are instituting, we don't believe are actually going to lead anywhere. Yeah, so these are our principles. We challenge the dichotomy between criminals and non-criminals. We criticize the ideas of laws of crime being neutral, and we believe that police and prisons cannot solve violence in our communities because they're part of violence. That's like the summary. Next part is about queer person basics.
Oh wait, no, you start this.
Yes, I do, but this is just the statistics. Prisoner Correspondence has chosen to focus specifically on queer prisoners because queer people are disproportionately more likely to be implicated in the criminal justice system, as I was saying before. We have statistics here that are kind of old. They're from 2019 and also American. But yeah, it says lesbian, gay, and bisexual people are much more likely to be arrested than straight people, especially straight women. And also that BIPOC transgender people are disproportionately harassed by police. This is information from 2021. Yes. So yeah, it says that 30% of BIPOC trans people have reported being harassed by police compared to 18% of white trans people, which is still 18% is still quite a high number, but it's obviously like multiple axes of oppression happening. Now I'm going to Rain.
Yes. Okay, so we were gonna talk a little bit, an overview of trans people, the Canadian prison system. Also, before that, wanted to mention as well some of the factors in terms of why we focus on queer and trans prisoners, aside from what Ivory just discussed, which is that queer people are obviously more impacted by the criminal justice system. Queer people are also more likely to be isolated from their families and communities, and considering that one of the functions of prison is to isolate people from community and separate them from society, queer people are disproportionately impacted by that when they are more likely to not have those family ties to offer them financial and emotional support, which is one of the things that we try to address as a project. Queer people are also more likely to be targets of violence by corrections officers and other prisoners. The Office of the Corrections Investigator in Canada found that individuals from the LGBTQ+ community are disproportionately represented as victims of violent and/or sexualized abuse, harassment, bullying, assault, and exploitation. This is by corrections officers as well as by other prisoners. And then we also wanted to get into some specific statistics about trans people in Canadian prisons. There's a lot of media talk a lot of the time about trans people in prison, and not a lot of discussion of trans people's actual experience in prison and how many trans people are in prison, etc. So that's some of the stuff that we're going to try to share, some of the limited information that we have. So according to Corrections Services Canada, the federal level of corrections, in 2021, there were 99 trans prisoners in federal custody. Of those, 62% identified as trans women and 21% as trans men. In Ontario, the only report available states that 100 trans prisoners were placed in solitary confinement in 2019 to 2020. This does not tell us the total number, only those that were placed in solitary confinement. So we can assume that the total number of trans prisoners who were incarcerated in that year provincially in Ontario would have been higher. In general, we also believe these numbers to be an undercount because you have to go back because it tells you the answer to the question. We believe these numbers to be an undercount because a lot of trans people are not out in prison, including trans people who are out on the street and out even to other prisoners, are not recognized as such as trans by correction services. And many trans people, particularly in provincial prisons, those who are pretrial or have very short sentences, don't consider it worth it to come out when it would open them up to administrative abuse. So following this, we have another question on Menti, which Ivory is going to take us to. So I'll give people a moment to like go to the website and look at this. But the question is, and this is just a true or false question. According to Corrections Services Canada policy, transgender prisoners can be placed in the institution of their choice. It's like 50-50. Yeah, I'll give people like a few seconds or yeah, a little moment to think about this question, what you know about this question, or what you might guess about this question. And then we will tell you the answer. So I'll wait for like one more person to vote and then I'll call it, I guess. Okay, one more person voted. So the answer to this is that it's like a little bit of a trick question. Because the policy does state that transgender prisoners can request to be placed in a prison based on their self-identification. However, this is the policy unless, quote, there are overriding health or safety concerns which cannot be resolved. In practice, we see that these health and safety concerns, yes, exactly. In practice, we see that these health and safety concerns are brought up very frequently as a reason to deny requests for transfers. This type of policy of self-identification, unless there are health and safety concerns, is also the policy in Ontario provincially, though we have a little bit less data there. So what we see in practice is that 67% of trans women are housed in men's prisons. A lot of those trans women actually are in a particular men's prison in Ontario called Bath Institution. It's a thing that correctional services will tend to do, like group people with a particular identity in a particular prison, though it's often or almost always not a public policy. And 95% of trans men were housed in women's prisons. In practice, we often, and advocates and lawyers for trans prisoners have often found that the deciding factor as to whether trans women are placed in a women's prison is actually whether they have had surgery, specifically bottom surgery. And there's even been reports of trans women who underwent or planned to undergo bottom surgery, and were told they may not be able to transfer to a women's prison, were not given information until either right before or even weeks after their surgery of where they would be transferred, which is really scary if you are a trans woman in prison, not knowing whether you will be, after your surgery, sent back to a men's institution where you would be more at risk than before, or finally transferred to a women's institution, usually after a lot of fighting. Trans people in Canadian prison also frequently, yes, people are often put in solitary confinement in prison. Trans people are particularly often placed in solitary confinement for their own safety or for other prisoners' safety, and serve very long periods of time in solitary or quote unquote protective confinement. So yeah, trans people in prison frequently experience and report sexual assault, violence, abuse by corrections officers, denial of hormone care, alongside a wide variety of other issues. And the federal government is not doing anything to really study these issues or report on them. And meanwhile has published really the only report where they investigated something about trans prisoners in federal Canadian prison, was entitled Gender Diverse Offenders with a History of Sexual Offending. And this is a media and government narrative that we see over and over, playing out fear tactics about trans people being deceptive and predatory, meanwhile not gathering statistics on, for example, trans people experiencing sexual assault in prison or outside of prison. So that's something that we take really seriously. And with all of these issues that trans people are facing, that everyone is facing. We feel that there is a need and an opportunity to create solidarity within the queer community across prison bars, so between incarcerated and non-incarcerated queer and trans and LGBTQ plus people. And to draw on, as Ivory sort of highlighted already, the larger history of activism in the LGBTQ community, and to sort of create ties between the community and the prison justice movement. And so I'll also tell you guys a little bit about us, because that's sort of our general mission and what we do as a project to sort of bridge that gap. So our goal is to create those between inside and outside members of the queer community. PCP was established in 2007 as grew out of a pen pal program based in the US. And we've had over 4,000 members sign up. Due to absolute numbers in the population, as well as in the prison population, we have way more American members, actually, incarcerated members in our database than we do Canadians, just because there's so many more people in the US, and there's also so many more, such a higher incarceration rate. But we do try to actively do outreach with Canadian members, because there are not a lot of resources for LGBTQ people in prison in Canada. We operate on a model of solidarity, not charity, meaning that we don't come in with condescending notions of helping prisoners, but instead recognize that all of our struggles for liberation are bound up with each other, and that we have a lot to learn from each other, and that in particular, as non-incarcerated people, we have a lot to learn from incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people. We also support all LGBTQ plus prisoners without any screenings or background checks into what crimes they've committed. So in practice, what we do on a day-to-day is that we host a database where our members write to us and share a little bio about themselves, and then we have listings that queer and trans people on the outside can write to us and get access to, and that allows people to match with pen pals. We've had around 1,500 pen pal connections over the lifetime of PCP, and we have almost 3,000 people currently who are waiting to be matched with pen pals in prison since as far back as 2017. So that is a need that is always there. And we're always looking for new people to get involved writing to prison. We run a resource library from which people can request zines, and we send out an annual newsletter. A lot of prisoners don't have access to the internet or other technology, so we spend a lot of time physically processing mail at our office. We always have physical letters around. I have physical letters around right now, always. And we're run by a small volunteer collective of about 6 outside members who do more logistical day-to-day operations of the project and outreach, and about 10-ish inside collective members who provide more, who sort of advise us and provide guidance and feedback on the broader direction of the project. And we also have volunteers and who sometimes also can help us remotely with some roles recently. And that's something that if anyone is in Montreal or I don't know, visits Montreal, has friends in Montreal, we are always looking for volunteers as well. So to follow up on that, we wanted to talk a little bit more specifically as well. Very relevant right now, we wanted to talk about advocacy in prison. This has come up a lot with the current wave of transphobic backlash, especially in prisons. So most recently in the US, what we saw Trump's executive order in January meant that trans women and women's institutions were being threatened to be transferred to men's institutions. Hormone care was being denied to trans people in prison, as well as other accommodations being taken away. When this started, a couple of women in the federal prison system got in touch with us because they needed help. One of the things that we saw right away was that news was not getting to people inside. And we were being asked to like send a copy of the executive order because the policies were changing in their prison, and this was affecting them greatly, but they didn't actually have access to the policy to know if what the policy changes in their prison were even legal. And when there was an injunction stopping certain aspects of this executive order, when I wrote to these people inside to say, what has changed for you, they sometimes didn't even know that the injunction existed. So that news sharing in this case is super, super important. What also is important, I think you can go to the next slide, is sending regular check-ins to people inside, saying what's going on for you, getting that information also from them, and sharing that, providing support for that, and as well anonymously with permission, sharing some of that with incarcerated people, with people through our social media, because a lot of that information also wasn't getting out in terms of exactly what was happening in prisons. We also connected people with lawyers to speed up the process and assembled a list of legal organizations that were doing work on this front. This work continues, but we've been able to see meaningful changes for our community inside. This work is always needed for people inside. In Canada, we recently saw in the previous election, Pierre Poilievre threatening to send trans women who were in federal women's prison, which only about 20 people, back to men's prison. Although he was defeated in the election, we still see this as a potential threat that we should be aware of and prepared for. We also just last week saw Quebec change their policies on transgender people inside to say that trans people have to be housed according to their quote anatomical sex. And this is, a really regressive change that we are having to address right now in Quebec. And we should be aware that the same kinds of regressive changes could happen anywhere, especially with the kind of different policies and bills that we've been seeing in general against transgender people in the US. So it's something that we should be prepared for. And in terms of being prepared for that, we do believe in the importance of one-on-one relationships. And this is one of the sort of avenues that we see for the pen pal relationship. So, being able to check in on someone on a regular basis, find out what's going on with them, being able to write letters of support for parole, being able to challenge mail rejections, being able to send news inside, being able to connect someone with organizations. This is work that is much easier done when it is spread out between queer people and queer activists who are connected to each other. And that is kind of something that we think is really, really important right now. And this is something we see as one of the merits of the pen pal program that we want to sort of emphasize more, is that you're not just it's not just about the possibility to make a new friend and build a relationship, although those things are really great. It's about doing a tangible act of solidarity in a context where a lot of prisoners don't have family support or other support. Being able to do even some of these things, like send news inside and check in on someone, is a tangible step forward for them. And yeah, I think I'm passing it back to Ivory to just share some resources, and then we'll do questions.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out some abolitionist groups working in Ontario, of which I see one is here right now. Awesome, thank you. We love the work that you do. But yeah, so PASAN is a group that is very similar to us. They support people in prison with HIV/AIDS. They're an abolitionist group. They're super rad. There's also the Canadian Association of Elizabeth Fry Societies. The nationally is actually quite progressive and abolitionist. The Disability Justice Network of Ontario has like a specific project related to disability and prison, which is really cool, and I really highly encourage people to check them out. And there's also Right On, which is a group that's based, I don't remember if it's Ottawa or Toronto, but they support prisoners through correspondence, but more of like on a research process, which, as Rain was saying, is really important because like news literally just doesn't get inside. Information is very difficult to get inside. And yeah, if y'all want further reading, these are some like a very short list of things that we think would be interesting. There's always Placing Black Lives by Robin Maynard for a discussion of anti-blackness in policing prisons of Canada. Extra Magazine has been doing some really good coverage about transphobia in Canada's prison systems. PrisonRadio.org isn't Canada specific, but it's kind of nice to hear the voices of people inside talking about what they're going through. And yeah, there's also some zines that you can find basically if you Google them. ABO Comics, the last one I'll just point out, is like a group based in Texas that specifically works with queer prisoners to publish like their artwork in zines. So yeah. Shall we get into the questions?
Yeah.
Do we have
Sorry
to
that there's
stop
not
the
too much
recording?
time for questions, but